Hey everybody, today we are finishing up our last bit of the American Revolution. It's good to see everyone again, and I hope everybody had a great Easter. So we're going to get back into our story. We left off with the British forces deciding to stay in Yorktown throughout the winter. And General George Washington is up in New York City, and he's starting to march down to Yorktown. Alright, so let's pick up. Now back to Washington. And at last, we were ready to return to George Washington. Last we saw him, his face was bright with excitement. And this is why, down in Yorktown, Cornwallis and his entire army were in a trap. And the best part was, they didn't know it. It was just a question of timing. If Washington could quickly march his army south to Virginia, he could surround Yorktown by land. And if the French warships took control of Chesapeake Bay, they could surround Yorktown by water. Of course, all this had to happen before Cornwallis realized the deadly danger of his position. "We have not a moment to lose," Washington said. The race was on. The trap slammed shut. "Our destination has been, for some time, a matter of perplexed doubt and uncertainty," wrote Dr. James Thatcher, as he marched south with Washington's army. The soldiers actually placed bets on where they were going to be going. This confusion was just what Washington wanted. He needed the British to believe he was moving his soldiers into position to attack New York City. He even had his engineers build huge bread ovens around New York. This helped trick General Clinton into believing that the Americans were planning to stay there for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, Washington continued racing his army towards Virginia, as far and as fast as he could. Cornwallis, on the other hand, was still in Yorktown. But where was the French fleet? He could get no update from the French naval commander about his location, and this made George Washington upset. On September 5th, just south of Philadelphia, a messenger finally brought Washington a stack of letters. He opened them and started reading. At this very moment, the French fleet was rowing up to the American camp. The generals down there looked towards the shore and witnessed a very strange sight. I caught sight of General George Washington waving his hat at me. Gestures of great joy. As the generals stepped off the boat, Washington ran up to the Frenchman, hugged him, and told him the good news. 28 French warships had just arrived in the Chesapeake Bay and were now surrounding Yorktown by water. Washington rushed his army to Yorktown to slam the trap on Cornwallis. "We have got him handsomely in the pudding bag," announced General George Washington. Hooray for the Americans! More than 7,000 British and German soldiers suddenly found themselves surrounded at Yorktown. Cornwallis begged Clinton to send help immediately. "If you cannot relieve me very soon," he wrote, "you must be prepared to hear the worst." But with French ships controlling the Chesapeake Bay, British ships couldn't get anywhere near Yorktown. At least Cornwallis still had his trusted waiter, James Armistead. And in the desperate situation, Cornwallis asked Armistead for a remarkable favor. He asked Armistead to spy on the Americans. Remember that Armistead was already an American who was spying on the British. Armistead gladly took the job. He snuck over to the American camp and reported to General Lafayette, now as one of the country's first double agents. Armistead was able to move easily back and forth between British and American camps. He gave Lafayette key intelligence and fed Cornwallis information that was useless or just plain wrong. Meanwhile, Washington tightened the rope around Cornwallis's neck by inching his soldiers closer and closer to Yorktown. It's fitting that Joseph Plum Martin, after 6 long years in the army, was here at Yorktown for the final battle. On October 8th, Martin and the rest of the army proudly watched the rising of the American flag, the signal to begin blasting cannons at Yorktown. Martin reported, "About noon, the much-wished-for signal went up. I confess I felt a secret pride swell in my heart when I saw the Star-Spangled Banner waving majestically." "Hooray for the Americans!" shouted the French soldiers. Then about 100 Americans and French cannons opened fire. The French cannonballs smashed right into the buildings in Yorktown. Many of the American cannonballs plopped into the river or landed in empty fields. The British shot back with everything they had, and the fire-tail cannonballs crossed each other in the air. Washington stood out in the open, watching the bombs explode in Yorktown. An officer named David Cobb urged the commander to be more careful. Washington had worked 7 long years for this moment, and he wasn't going to miss anything. The White Handkerchief. Nothing nearly this funny was happening in Cornwallis's camp. "We get terrible provisions now," said the miserable British soldiers in Yorktown. Putrid meat and wormy biscuits had spilled on the ships. Many of them have even made their men sick. In October, Washington started to see dead horses floating in the York River outside the British camp. The meaning was clear. The British didn't even have enough food left to feed their animals. Sensing that victory was near, the Americans and the French kept bombing Yorktown day and night. Then, on the morning of October 17th, a teenage British drummer came out of Yorktown beating his drums. The Americans couldn't hear the drums over the sounds of exploding cannonballs, but behind the drummer boy, they saw what they were waiting for. A British officer waving a white handkerchief. Cornwallis was ready to surrender. The world turned upside down. The official surrender took place on the afternoon of October 19th, 1781. Altogether, 7,247 British and German soldiers marched out of Yorktown and threw down their guns. They really threw them down, and they were trying to break them so that the Americans wouldn't be able to use them. A British marching band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," and upside down is exactly how Charles Cornwallis felt on October 19th. In fact, he was so upset by this defeat that he sent a message to Washington saying he was too sick to come to the surrender ceremony. When Cornwallis finally did meet with the Americans a few days later, he was in for one final shock. There, in the American camp, proudly wearing his American uniform, was Cornwallis' trusted waiter, James Armistead. It was all over. Washington wrote a quick note to Congress telling them the big news. "I have the honor to inform Congress," he began, "that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected." The news spread quickly, sparking celebration from Georgia to New Hampshire. The reaction was quite different in London. When the Yorktown news arrived in late November, it struck Lord Frederick North like a bullet to the chest. Remember, this is the guy who once so boldly declared, "America must fear you before she can love you." Now, he started pacing up and down in the room, waving his arms wildly and shouting, "Oh God, it's all over." King George didn't agree. "I have no doubt," he wrote, "that when men are a little recovered from the shock felt by the bad news, they will find the necessity to carry on the war." When it became obvious that the king was the only person on the planet who felt this way, he got so depressed that he actually tried to give up his crown. George's friends talked him out of this rash decision, and the king finally accepted the fact that the United States had won its independence. Peace talks began. Ben Franklin and John Adams, still driving each other crazy, represented the Americans. This is goodbye. The American Revolution officially ended on September 3rd, 1783, with the signing of the peace treaty in Paris. All over the country, American soldiers started heading home. Deborah Sampson took off her army uniform, put on a woman's clothes, and walked through camp. No one recognized her. Joseph Plum Martin, now 23, had dreamed of this day for years, but now that it was here, he wasn't quite sure how he felt. "I can assure the reader that there was as much sorrow as joy," he wrote. "We had lived together as a family of brothers for several years." George Washington and his officers felt the same mixed emotions when they got together one last time. in New York City. The general lifted his drink in the air and said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devotedly wish that you will see each other in later prosperous and happy days as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." Then he asked each of his companions to come up and shake his hand. Henry Knox, who was the nearest, stepped up to Washington and took him by the hand. The room was silent. Every man in the place was trying desperately to keep his emotions under control. But it was to no use. General Knox was the first to crack. Knox burst into tears and grabbed Washington in a big bear hug. Then all the other officers, tears streaming down their cheeks, lined up to hug the commander. "Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I had never before witnessed," said Benjamin Tallman. Later that afternoon, Washington dried his eyes, left the tavern, walked down the street to the wharf, and stepped onto a waiting boat. He turned and waved his hat to his friends as the boat rowed away from the shore. Washington stopped in Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress was now meeting, to officially resign as commander of the Continental Army. "Having now finished the work assigned to me," he told the members of Congress, "I retire from the great theater of action." Then he traveled home to Virginia to enjoy a peaceful retirement with Martha Washington at Mount Vernon. Well, that's what he thought anyway. So that's where our American Revolutionary story ends, with the Americans winning their independence from Great Britain. George Washington becomes the big hero of the war, and he ends up resigning as commander of the Continental Army to go to his wife Martha Washington to live in retirement. But with history already happening, we already know what happens to George Washington a couple years later when he becomes our first president. So I really enjoyed reading the story to all of you over the last couple of weeks, and I look forward to continuing more about the American Revolution and different things about history and social studies. So also I will be continuing to do videos often on the YouTube channel. So it was great seeing everybody, and go enjoy a nice sunny day. Bye.